Will, written by Mark Manson and Will Smith. Summarized by Detailed Book Summaries. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 1: Fear. What's the one moment from childhood that never leaves you? The one that creeps in during your quietest nights or flashes without warning in the middle of joy. For Will Smith, that moment happened when he was just 9 years old. It wasn't a birthday party, a holiday, or even a schoolyard triumph. It was the moment he watched his father punch his mother in the side of her head so hard that she crumpled to the floor. And what did young Will do? Nothing. He just stood there paralyzed, frozen in fear, powerless. That moment would go on to define his life, not just as a scar but as a blueprint. Everything that came later, his humor, his charm, his success, was in some way a response to that frozen silence. Will doesn't start his memoir with success or fame. He begins in the rubble of childhood trauma, because that's where the real story lives. That's where the character is born. Will grew up in West Philadelphia in a house ruled by discipline, structure, and an ever-present tension. His father, Willard Carroll Smith Sr., or Daddy-O, was brilliant, hardworking, and fiercely principled. He demanded excellence and ran the household like a boot camp. But Daddy-O was also unpredictable, volatile, and at times violent. For Will, navigating his father's moods became a daily mission. Every word, every gesture had to be carefully calibrated. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. But he could perform. Humor became Will's earliest survival skill. It wasn't just about being funny, it was about changing the temperature in a room. If Daddy-O was on edge, a well-timed joke could defuse the ticking bomb. If his mother was sad, a silly face might coax a smile. Even as a child, Will recognized the power of laughter. It was a shield, a weapon, and a bomb. It gave him something he desperately needed: a sense of control. In that crucible of fear, something remarkable happened. Will discovered performance, not as an art form but as a necessity. His talent for mimicry, his timing, his understanding of people's emotions, all of it came from trying to survive. And here's the deeper truth. Many of us develop our gifts not from a place of joy, but from a place of fear. We become adaptable, observant, funny, or hardworking because we're trying to cope. Will Smith didn't become a superstar just because he was talented. He became one because he had to become something more than the scared little boy standing helpless in the living room. But that performance had a cost. It created a mask, a version of Will that was charming, likable, and endlessly entertaining, but also deeply disconnected from his true self. In fact, Will talks about living as 3 different versions of himself. First, there was Will the kid, curious, imaginative, and quietly wounded. Then there was Will the performer, slick, funny, and always seeking approval. And finally, there was Will the strategist, methodical, ambitious, and obsessed with perfection. Each persona served a purpose. Each helped him survive and eventually thrive. But none of them fully captured who he really was. And looming over all of this was the guilt of that one moment. Will couldn't shake the image of his mother falling to the ground and his own paralyzed body doing nothing to stop it. That guilt became a silent engine, driving him to achieve, to excel, to control every variable in his life. If he could be perfect at everything, maybe he could erase that moment. Maybe he could forgive himself for being a coward. But guilt is a slippery thing. It doesn't just go away because you win Grammys or become the biggest movie star in the world. What makes this chapter even more profound is how Will talks about his father. He doesn't paint Daddy-O as a monster. On the contrary, he describes him as one of the greatest men he's ever known. Daddy-O was a genius in his own right. A man who built machines from scratch, who taught his children the value of precision, discipline, and hard work. He was a provider, a visionary, and someone who demanded the best from his family. But he was also a man at war with himself. A man whose anger sometimes exploded in terrifying ways. Will holds both truths at once. Daddy-O was both the builder and the breaker, the hero and the villain. And that duality is something Will wrestles with throughout his life. This forces a question that many of us face. What do we do with the people who shaped us in both beautiful and broken ways? How do we reconcile love with pain? Will doesn't offer a simple answer. But he invites us to live in that complexity with honesty. Maybe healing doesn't come from having all the answers, but from having the courage to sit with the contradictions. By the end of chapter 1, It becomes clear that this book isn't just a recounting of fame and fortune. It's an emotional excavation. Will is saying, "Before I was the Fresh Prince, before the movie stardom, before the global fame, I was a scared little boy who learned how to be funny to stay safe." And in that confession, he invites us to reflect on our own lives. What fears shaped your identity? What part of your personality was born from pain? Are you still performing? Or are you finally ready to live as your true self? Will's story reminds us that strength and vulnerability aren't opposites, they're intertwined. Our greatest achievements are often rooted in our deepest wounds. But it's only when we acknowledge those roots that we can truly grow beyond them. Chapter 1 is a powerful beginning. It's raw, unflinching, and deeply human. And it sets the stage for a journey that's not just about becoming famous, but about becoming whole. Chapter 2, Fantasy. If fear is what first shaped Will Smith's reality, fantasy is where he began rewriting it. He didn't have much control over the outside world as a kid, not with a father as commanding as Daddy-O or a home brimming with tension and strict routines. But inside his head, he was limitless. In his imagination, he wasn't the scared boy who stood still as his mother collapsed. In his mind, he was a hero, a builder, a creator of worlds where he never froze. He moved, acted, saved, and soared. This chapter takes us inside that imagination, where Will, still a boy, learned to cope not by confrontation but through escape. He didn't rebel outwardly. He didn't scream or slam doors. He withdrew into colorful mental landscapes full of stories, characters, scenarios, entire universes that bent to his will. And in those imagined worlds, he was brave. He was respected. He had agency. He had control. His fantasy life wasn't idle daydreaming. It was intentional, vivid, and detailed. Will built characters like Rock, an alter ego who was everything young Will felt he wasn't: tough, fearless, smooth with girls, always ready with a comeback or a clever line. Rock was the version of himself he longed to be. The moment he created Rock, something shifted. Pretending didn't feel like pretending anymore. Felt like practice. Like sculpting clay, he was shaping a new self from his imagination. And it wasn't just a mask, it was a prototype. It's incredible how the mind works in survival. Some people retreat inward and stay hidden there. Others, like Will, turn their inner retreat into a creative lab, producing solutions for the life they want to live. While the real Will was obedient, respectful, and eager to please, his inner self was loud, brave, and captivating. He was rehearsing his future, and though he didn't fully know it yet, he was laying the groundwork for the Fresh Prince to emerge. This fantasy wasn't limited to mental scripts. Will loved building things, structures, gadgets, imaginary sets, entire plotlines, and he loved sound. Rhythm and rhyme came naturally. He'd listen to music, then recreate it, then top it with his own lyrics. He discovered his ability to manipulate language and rhythm the way others played instruments. Words became a playground where he could flip meanings, shift pace, deliver punchlines with precision. And once he got a taste of that power, once he saw people react to it, he was hooked. At school, Will was starting to gain a reputation. He was funny, quick, and always had a performance ready. He could roast, rhyme, dance, joke, whatever the moment demanded. Teachers liked him. Kids gravitated toward him. He had charisma and control, two things he lacked at home but found on stage. Even when there was no stage, he made one: in the classroom, in the hallway, even inside his own mind. He wasn't just fantasizing anymore. He was acting it out. And music became the bridge between fantasy and identity. Will began writing raps, mimicking his hip-hop heroes, internalizing their style, and adding his own flair. Grandmaster Flash, Rakim, Run DMC, these weren't just entertainers to him. They were blueprints. He studied their wordplay, their swagger, their flow, and molded them into his own voice. He didn't want to just copy. He wanted to create. He began to believe that what was once fantasy could actually be his future. Yet, even as the dream grew louder, reality remained strict. Daddy-O's rules didn't soften. Will was still expected to get straight A's, be on time, follow the family code. So he lived a double life. The dutiful son at home. The wild, hilarious, charismatic star inside his head and at school. Two Wills. Both real. Both incomplete on their own. He shares one vivid moment from this chapter that captures that split perfectly. He's sitting in school, zoned out, not because he's bored, but because he's designing a concert in his mind. Lights, Smoke, sound effects, crowd reactions, costume changes. He's not just imagining it, he's engineering it. While other kids are thinking about homework or lunch, he's producing a show that hasn't happened yet but already feels like his destiny. That kind of vision isn't random. It's powerful. It's prophetic. He wasn't waiting for the world to discover him. He was already living the life he wanted in his head. And that's what makes this chapter so moving. It reminds us that fantasy isn't childish. It's a rehearsal. It's how we experiment with possibilities. Will wasn't just entertaining himself. He was constructing the psychological and emotional muscles he would need to thrive. His fantasies weren't distractions. They were directions. But there's a quiet warning beneath it all. Fantasy is a beautiful place, but it can become a trap. If we live too long in our made-up worlds, we risk forgetting how to be vulnerable in the real one. Will was building personas that were charming, confident, and unbreakable. But the more polished those personas became, the harder it was to admit when he felt scared or hurt or unsure. The fantasy was a shield, but it was also a barrier. Still, the momentum was building. His fantasy was leaking into reality. He started performing at school. Friends were giving him beats to rhyme over. He was writing with intention now, not just to escape but to express. That's when the difference started to matter. Fantasy had helped him survive. Now it was helping him create. By the end of this chapter, Will is still just a kid, but one with a clear direction. He's no longer running from fear. He's running toward a future he can see, because he's already lived it in his mind 100 times over. He just needs the world to catch up. What does this mean for us? It means we need to give more credit to the fantasies we build. They may look like childish escapes, but inside them are blueprints. Hidden among the daydreams are clues about what we truly want and who we're trying to become. Will teaches us that when you begin to take your fantasy seriously, you can start shaping it into something real. This chapter is about belief. Not blind optimism, but the kind of belief that's forged in the imagination and confirmed in effort. Will didn't stumble into stardom. He designed it. First in his mind, then in his rhymes, then on the stages of Philadelphia, and later the world. Fantasy wasn't a weakness. It was a superpower. And in Will's case, it was the first true step toward freedom. Chapter 3: Performance. By the time Will Smith reached his teens, the world inside his head had started to seep into the real one. The fantasies, the imagined performances, the alter egos, they'd all been practice runs for something deeper, something inevitable. He had spent years rehearsing in private, sharpening his wit, crafting personas, mimicking voices, flipping rhymes in the mirror. But now the world was watching. The performance had begun, and with it came something electric: feedback. For the first time, Will began to experience the rush of real-time response, laughter, applause, attention, admiration. And that changed everything. He wasn't just dreaming anymore. He was doing. The first time he performed publicly, it was as if something inside him snapped into place. The awkward, scared, overly cautious kid was still there, but he now had armor. The mic became his weapon, and humor, timing, rhythm, charm, those were his tools. It wasn't just about entertaining. It was about owning the room. When he walked on stage and delivered a rhyme, cracked a joke, or flashed that now famous smile, he could feel the temperature shift. People leaned in. They lit up. They laughed. He had power. And it was addictive. More than applause or praise, it was control. Emotional control. The same ability he once used to de-escalate tension at home was now playing out on a bigger scale. Make someone laugh? You controlled their emotion. Deliver a perfect punchline or a rapid-fire rhyme. You commanded their attention. That kind of influence becomes a kind of currency, and Will wanted more of it. He wasn't just learning how to perform. He was learning how to command. At school, he leaned into this gift. He wasn't the biggest or the toughest, but he didn't need to be. He had verbal agility, charisma, and humor on his side. He could roast you in front of your friends and still have you laughing with him. Teachers loved him because he was bright and engaging. Students loved him because he was funny and cool. His mouth became his engine, and he knew how to use it. That's when people started calling him Prince. He walked with a kind of ease, a quiet self-assurance that made him feel elevated. He carried himself differently, clean, smooth, articulate, and clever. That nickname, Prince, was more than playful. It was the beginning of a brand. He was starting to shape not just how he saw himself but how the world saw him. Soon it evolved into something bigger, the Fresh Prince. The name had a rhythm, a shine. It stuck. But performance is never just about talent. It's also about partnership. And then came DJ Jazzy Jeff. Jeff was already working local gigs, spinning at house parties, a master of turntables who knew how to move a crowd. When Will met Jeff, it was like two puzzle pieces snapping together. Will had the voice, the presence, the lyrics. Jeff had the beats, the skills, the gear. Their chemistry was instant and undeniable. Will asked for a shot, Jeff gave it to him, and the rest began to write itself. They started small house parties, school events, wherever they could find a crowd. And from the very beginning it was clear they had something special. Jeff would lay down the beat, Will would ride it like he was born to do it. He had rhythm, flow, storytelling, charisma. And he knew how to read a room. If a rhyme wasn't landing, he switched it. If the energy dipped, he brought it back. He was crafting something in real time every time. That's the thing about performance, you can't fake presence. And Will had it in spades. But with that rise came pressure. Because once people expect you to perform, there's no going back. And for Will, performing wasn't just an activity. It had become an identity. If he didn't kill it on stage, who was he? If the crowd didn't respond, what did it mean about him? The lines were blurring fast. The charming, funny, effortless version of himself he presented to the world, was that really him? Or was that just the character he had built to survive? And beneath all the hype, that question lingered. Am I enough when I'm not performing? He didn't have time to answer it. He just kept going, chasing the next crowd, the next set, the next rush. And yet, with every performance, the need for perfection grew. He wasn't just trying to be good. He was trying to be flawless. Because if he nailed the performance, he didn't have to feel the fear. If he got the laugh, the rhyme, the rhythm right, he didn't have to feel vulnerable. The performance became a wall, strong, smooth, impenetrable. That wall began to shape every part of his life. Even outside of music, Will was always on. He was the entertainer at the dinner table, the charmer in the classroom, the guy who could shift the mood with a single joke. And it worked. People loved it. But deep inside, he was starting to feel the weight of having to always deliver. Of never being able to just be. Because when your worth is tied to how well you perform, silence becomes terrifying. Stillness becomes unbearable. But in those early days, that weight wasn't visible yet. The world was starting to take notice. Will and Jeff were building momentum. They were performing, connecting, rising. They didn't have money or contracts or any guarantees, but they had something more important. A taste of greatness. And Will was all in. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just dreaming about being heard, he was being heard. The fantasy was now fact. The rhymes he'd written in his notebook, the lines he'd rehearsed in his bedroom, the character he had created in his mind, it was all alive now, out in the open. And the world was clapping. But what no one saw yet was that the real performance wasn't just happening on stage. It was happening inside. The boy who had once learned to hide his fear behind a joke was now learning to live his entire life behind the mask of charisma. And the better he got at it, the harder it became to take it off. Still, none of that mattered in the moment. He had found his calling. He was in his zone. And for now, the lights were bright, the crowd was loud, and the boy who once disappeared into fantasy had become the performer everyone wanted to see. Chapter 4: Power. By the time Will Smith was 17, the fantasy that had carried him through childhood and the performance that helped him survive his teenage years had matured into something with real weight, power. And it didn't arrive slowly. It came crashing in, loud and undeniable, like the first thunderclap of a summer storm. One minute, he was performing at house parties and talent shows. The next, he was being noticed by people who mattered: industry insiders, record execs, DJs with pull. Everything he had imagined in the safety of his own mind was now unfolding in real life. The spotlight was no longer a dream. It was his new reality. What made it all click wasn't just talent. It was timing, opportunity, and something more subtle but equally important: readiness. Will had spent years rehearsing in the dark. Every joke, every rhyme, every facial expression. So when the door cracked open, he didn't tiptoe through it. He kicked it wide open. It started with a party. Jeff had a gig and Will, smooth-talking and hungry, grabbed the mic and lit up the room. What they didn't know at the time was that a girl in the crowd, Dana, worked with a promoter who had major industry ties. She passed the word up the chain. Suddenly, Will and Jeff had momentum. That's the thing about power. It often begins with small moments that feel insignificant at the time. One performance. One connection. One person believing in you. For Will and Jeff, it led to a meeting with Russell Simmons. Def Jam didn't sign them, but another label, Jive Records, did. And just like that, two kids from Philly were about to go national. Their debut single, Girls Ain't Nothing But Trouble, hit the airwaves with a bang. It was catchy, clean, clever. Didn't try to be hard. It just told a story and people loved it. Will wasn't trying to intimidate anyone. He was trying to entertain. With the record deal came visibility. With visibility came attention. And with attention came money. Fast. For a teenager who'd grown up watching every penny, suddenly having thousands at his disposal was dizzying. He didn't just buy stuff, he flexed. Cars, clothes, gadgets. He once bought a BMW not because he needed it, but because someone told him he couldn't afford it. That's what power does when you're young and untrained in its weight. It makes you perform for it. You want to prove you're worthy. You want to prove you belong. But with that kind of success, something dangerous begins to happen. The applause becomes addictive. The persona becomes expected. And instead of using power, you start serving it. Will had spent so long building the perfect version of himself, the funny, confident, always on Fresh Prince, that he didn't know how to slow down. He had to be the guy with the punchline, the guy with the smile, the guy who had it all figured out. And if he wasn't that guy, who was he? He started feeling the pressure not just to perform but to sustain. Family members reached out with financial requests. Friends wanted favors. Everyone around him saw the glow and wanted a piece of the heat. He was surrounded by people who said yes to him, and when everyone agrees with you, it becomes hard to tell what's true. Even harder to hear when you're veering off course. No one told him to slow down. No one warned him about taxes or budgeting. He was just expected to keep climbing. But power has a way of exposing whatever's unresolved beneath the surface. Will still hadn't dealt with the scared boy who watched his parents fight. He still hadn't processed what it meant to perform as a way of protecting himself. All of that stayed tucked beneath the success out of view, until it couldn't be hidden anymore. Yet, for a while things just worked. The music was popping. The name Fresh Prince was becoming known. He was traveling, performing, living the life he used to daydream about. And to be fair, he was good at it. Really good. He wasn't just lucky. He was sharp, disciplined, and aware. He read crowds. He adapted fast. He understood entertainment instinctively. That's a kind of power most people never develop, no matter how long they chase it. And it made him feel invincible, like he could will anything into being. He'd fantasized success. Then he'd performed his way into it. Now he had the money, the fame, the brand. He had taken what was once imaginary and made it real. But as the saying goes, getting to the top is one thing, staying there is something else entirely. He was also starting to learn that power shifts people. Not just the one who has it, but everyone around them. Some people became clingy. Others became distant. Some tried to exploit the shine. Others tried to dim it. Will wasn't just managing his own rise. He was managing expectations, loyalty, jealousy, and confusion, all while still being a teenager. And yet, amid all of that noise, something clicked for him on a deeper level. This wasn't just about music. This was about identity, about transformation, about stepping into the version of himself he always believed he could be. Power gave him the stage, but it also handed him the responsibility to choose who he would become. That realization was profound but also premature, because he hadn't yet faced the full consequences of power misused. There were cracks forming, spending without planning, relationships built on status, the emotional cost of always performing. But for the moment he was still flying. The crowds were still cheering. The money was still flowing. And the Fresh Prince was still rising. Power had taken a kid from West Philly and placed him on stages he couldn't have imagined just a year before. But it was also beginning to do what power always does. It was testing him. Testing his ego. Testing his values. Testing his vision. And although he didn't know it yet, the test was just beginning. Chapter 5: Hope. There's a moment in every dreamer's life when the lights dim, and everything you've built begins to crumble. For Will Smith, that moment came not with a bang, but with a slow creeping silence, the kind that settles in when money runs out, calls stop coming and people begin to disappear. Up until now, Will had been soaring. The Fresh Prince was on the rise, the performances were getting bigger, the confidence louder, and the power more intoxicating. But in Chapter 5, everything he thought was secure starts falling apart. And it happens because, like many young stars, Will hadn't yet learned the hardest lesson about success. If you don't manage it, it will manage you. At first, the money was thrilling. Will didn't grow up around wealth, so once the checks started rolling in, he did what many people do when they've never had. He spent. Lavishly. Recklessly. Joyfully. Cars. Clothes. Jewelry. He wasn't hoarding riches, he was trying to feel rich. He wanted the world to see his success, not just hear about it. To him, every flashy purchase was a declaration. I made it. But what Will didn't understand was taxes, or budgeting, or the way the IRS doesn't just go away if you ignore them. His financial education had never begun, and the people around him weren't stopping him either. So when the taxman finally came calling, Will had no cushion. Everything he owed was gone. He was broke. The kind of broke that isn't just uncomfortable. It's scary. And when you're broke in front of the world, the shame hits different. This wasn't private failure. It was public embarrassment. Will had built a brand around winning. The Fresh Prince didn't lose. He didn't struggle. He didn't flinch. But now he was hiding behind the very persona he had once used to survive. He kept up appearances, still smiling, still cracking jokes, still showing up, but inside he was panicked. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to admit it. And so, like any seasoned performer, he leaned deeper into the role. But what happens when the role becomes a mask you can't take off? Will found himself becoming a prisoner of his own performance. Every room he walked into required him to be on. The charm had to be constant. The confidence couldn't falter. And that meant there was no room for honesty, no space for fear. The very tools that had elevated him were now suffocating him. He couldn't say, I'm struggling, because the world only knew him as the one who had it all together. Behind closed doors, the pressure mounted. The calls weren't coming like they used to. The money wasn't flowing. The opportunities dried up. People who once smiled wide in his presence began to disappear. Will wasn't hot anymore. And in the entertainment industry, when you're no longer hot, you're invisible. And being invisible after you've known the spotlight? That's its own kind of pain. But the true destruction wasn't financial or professional. It was internal. Will's entire identity had been built on being the funny guy, the charismatic guy, the winning guy. When that collapsed, so did his sense of self. If he wasn't the Fresh Prince, then who was he? If people weren't laughing or clapping or nodding in approval, did he still matter? These weren't superficial questions, they were existential. Because when you've lived your life for the crowd, silence feels like death. And in that silence, Will began to crack. He didn't lash out or fall apart dramatically. Instead, he drifted. He disconnected. He pulled away from people. The confidence that once sparkled now felt heavy. The jokes felt forced. The mirror, once his best friend, became harder to face. He was tired, not just physically but spiritually. Exhausted from pretending, from chasing, from constantly trying to live up to a version of himself that no longer fit. Yet, something beautiful often hides in ruins. Destruction, for all its pain, clears space. And Will started to notice the difference between who he was pretending to be and who he might actually be. For the first time in a long time, he had no stage. No script. Just himself. And that terrified him but also intrigued him. What if there was something real underneath the persona? Something deeper than punchlines and chain necklaces? Still, he wasn't ready to face it fully. Not yet. The fall was still too fresh, the shame too raw. But seeds had been planted. Seeds of humility, of awareness, of new hunger. Not the hunger to impress, but to understand. He was beginning to feel the urge to rebuild. Not just his career, but his soul. But before any of that could begin, he had to sit in the ashes. He had to feel the weight of everything he'd lost. And more importantly, he had to accept that it wasn't all someone else's fault. He had played a role in his own downfall. The world around him hadn't changed. It had simply revealed what was already there. A young man with talent, yes, but also ego, naivete, and a fear of slowing down. That revelation stung. But it was also the beginning of wisdom. Because once you stop blaming the storm, you can start learning how to build a stronger house. In the end, Chapter 5 isn't just about destruction. It's about reckoning. It's about facing the ruins of the life you built without foundation and realizing that maybe, just maybe, it's the best thing that could have happened to you. Because now we'll have the chance to build again. Slower, smarter, and most of all, truer. Chapter 6, Ignorance. Silence that followed the applause. Will Smith didn't fold. He didn't disappear. He didn't run. He worked. And it wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. It was gritty, sweaty, uncelebrated hustle, the kind of grind you do not for cameras or clout but because there's no other choice. Because sitting still meant sinking. And Will had already tasted what it felt like to be invisible in an industry that feeds on shine. So he laced up. He got back in the booth. And he moved. The difference this time was that he wasn't just chasing a dream. He was chasing redemption. He had been to the top briefly and then watched it all vanish. And now he knew what was at stake. No more illusions. No more fairy tale. Just work. Relentless focus work. He and Jazzy Jeff started performing again, showing up wherever they could get a mic in a crowd. Clubs, schools, radio stations, whatever. The goal wasn't fame anymore. It was survival. It was dignity. Will was on a mission to get himself out of the hole. Financially, emotionally, spiritually. It was during this time that something shifted. Will began to respect the process. Before, it had all felt like magic. Fame falling into his lap. Money arriving like blessings from above. Now he understood that success didn't stick unless it was earned. Hustle taught him discipline. It taught him that being talented wasn't enough. You had to be consistent. You had to outwork everyone in the room. You had to get up even when you didn't feel like it, and especially when no one was watching. And then came the record. Parents just don't understand. It wasn't born from desperation, but from authenticity. Came from a real place, and that's why it worked. It was honest, funny, and full of the kind of storytelling people connected to. Didn't try to be cool. It didn't pretend to be street. It was Will. And when it hit the airwaves, it hit. It landed like a life raft. Not only did it revive their careers, it made history. The song went on to win the first ever Grammy for a rap performance. Will, the kid who had just been dodging IRS agents, was now standing on a global stage as a pioneer. The fall was still fresh, but now he had his foot back in the door. But hustle didn't stop there. If anything, that success reminded him of how quickly it could all go sideways again. So he kept pushing. He stayed sharp. He showed up to every session ready, every show hungry. He became obsessed with preparation. He didn't want to wing it anymore. He wanted to master it. He studied. He trained. He worked like someone who knew what it felt like to have nothing and wasn't willing to go back. And while the world saw a young star re-emerging, Will saw a man forming. He wasn't just performing songs anymore, he was building a future. He started thinking beyond music. He started dreaming bigger, but with a strategy this time. The kid who once fantasized in his room had now learned to anchor his dreams in effort. No more skipping steps. No more shortcuts. Just vision and grind. And that gave him a new kind of confidence. Not the cocky, performative kind, but a grounded, quiet fire that said, "I'm not here by accident. I earned this." He also began to shift internally. The ego that had once fueled his early flashiness had been tempered by pain. Now there was humility in his hustle. Gratitude in his grind. He no longer needed to prove he was the best. He just needed to know he'd done his best. That change made him not just a better artist, but a better man. He surrounded himself with people who pushed him, not praised him. He became selective about his energy. Focused. Purposeful. What's powerful about this chapter is that it shows what most people never see, the in-between. The rebuilding. The invisible work. The quiet moments when you choose not to give up. Not because you're sure it'll work, but because something inside you refuses to quit. That's hustle. That's what separated Will from the others who fell and never came back. He didn't let the fall define him. He used it as fuel. And slowly opportunity began to knock again. But this time he was ready. Not desperate. Not wide-eyed. Ready. And that readiness would be the difference. The boy who once lived in fantasy had stepped into something far more powerful. Reality with purpose, with resilience. and with hustle that didn't blink in the face of failure. Chapter 7 Adventure. Every life has a moment where the flame catches, where all the friction, grinding, and spark chasing finally ignites something real. For Will Smith, that moment came not when he was expecting it, not when he was aiming for it, but when he was staying ready in the background, still hungry, still building. He had clawed his way back from the bottom. He'd hustled after going broke, after watching his fame fade and his confidence fracture. He'd gotten the Grammy, sure, but even that hadn't guaranteed a future. In fact, nothing felt guaranteed anymore, except his resolve. He was done waiting to be discovered. Now he was willing to be ready whenever the door cracked open. And then one night it did. The idea didn't come from Will himself. It came from Benny Medina, a sharp, savvy music executive with a vision rooted in his own life. Benny had grown up in East LA and ended up living with a wealthy white family in Beverly Hills. That shift from street life to silver spoons was dramatic, jarring, and if you saw it through the right lens, hilarious. Benny thought, this could be a TV show. But not just any TV show. It needed a star with presence, rhythm, and that rare, effortless magnetism. He saw all that in Will. Will, though? He didn't take it seriously at first. He'd never acted. He didn't know the rules of that world, didn't speak its language. What he did know was how to entertain. He knew how to make people feel something, how to hold attention in the palm of his hand. Still, the jump from music to sitcom seemed like a canyon too wide to leap. Then he met Quincy Jones. Now Quincy didn't believe in taking the long route when the short one was wide open. He invited Will to a party. The room was filled with Hollywood royalty. Agents, producers, power players. Quincy said, here's the script. You want this role? You audition right here, right now. No rehearsal. No prep. Just guts. Will's first instinct was to stall. To say, give me a week. But Quincy, with that commanding don't miss your moment energy, leaned in and said, you've got 10 minutes. Make a decision. And Will, after pacing for a few moments in the driveway, did what he'd always done when life threw him a challenge. He leaned into the fire. He grabbed the script, came back inside, and read for everyone. It wasn't perfect, but it was him. Honest, funny, magnetic. And it worked. He got the part. In one night, with one decision, he landed the role that would change everything. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. But here's what most people never see. Getting the gig? That was the easy part. What followed was something entirely different: fear. Deep, real fear. Will had never acted before, not in a real capacity. The first few episodes were rough. You can literally watch him mouthing the lines of other actors on screen, just to know when to speak. He was out of his depth. He felt exposed. And yet he refused to sink. He started watching, studying, learning. He showed up early, stayed late. He asked questions. He took notes. He watched his own performances and figured out what didn't work, and how to fix it. Slowly something shifted. The confidence came back. But this time it wasn't puffed up with ego. It was rooted in effort, in craft, in ownership. Will started to become the Fresh Prince. Not just the character but the anchor of the show. He learned how to hit marks, how to work with cameras, how to build chemistry with his castmates. He grew, week by week, scene by scene. And the show itself? It blew up. Audiences loved it, not just because it was funny but because it meant something. It showed a black family that was rich, complex, and real. It tackled race and identity and class while still making you laugh till your ribs hurt. Will wasn't just entertaining now. He was helping shape culture. And it lit something inside him. A fire not just for performing but for impact. At the same time, though, the stakes got higher. He wasn't just a rapper trying something new. He was now a sitcom lead. A role model. A cultural figure. And the pressure came with that. He knew kids were watching him. Families were watching him. America was watching him. But instead of folding under that, he used it. He started thinking more seriously. Not just about what was funny but what was right, what was meaningful. And that's when he started realizing that this acting thing, it wasn't a detour. It was the next path, the next frontier, the next version of Will. Because ignition isn't just about catching fire. It's about recognizing when the spark becomes flame, when the joke becomes a message, when the moment becomes movement. Will had been through fantasy, failure, and hustle. Now he was stepping into something new, focus. The Fresh Prince was his launchpad, but he was already eyeing the stars beyond. That's the beauty of ignition. It doesn't just change your direction, it transforms your identity. And in that firelight, Will saw something he hadn't seen before. His potential wasn't just in how high he could rise, but in how deep he could go. Into craft, into message, into self. Chapter 8 Pain. Fame has a way of convincing you that you're invincible, that everything you touch will shine, that you can outwork uncertainty, outmaneuver pain, outsmart heartbreak. And for a while it feels like it's true. For Will Smith, that was the space he was living in. The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air had become a hit. The music was winning awards, the audience adored him, and the momentum was unreal. He was flying. But there was something else brewing beneath the momentum. An invisible current of pressure, perfectionism, and the need to control it all. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, almost noble. Because it looked like responsibility. It looked like discipline. But in reality it was fear, fear of loss, fear of chaos, fear of being exposed as less than what the world believed. He was doing everything right. On paper, Will was the picture of success. He was building his brand, elevating his profile, creating wealth, and even starting a family. But something inside him was tightening. He needed everything to be just so. He needed to manage every moving piece. He'd grown up in a house where unpredictability had teeth, where anger could snap at any moment. And so now in adulthood, he used control as a shield. If he could orchestrate the entire symphony of his life, every conversation, every relationship, every outcome, maybe he could protect the people he loved. Maybe he could protect himself. But the problem with that approach is that life isn't an equation. It's not a chemistry set where you can carefully mix your variables and guarantee gold. Alchemy isn't just science. It's chaos and soul and timing and luck. Will didn't know that yet. He believed if he worked hard enough and planned deeply enough, he could create harmony. Even in his relationships. Even in love. With Sherry, the woman who would become his first wife, the desire to build a perfect life was intense. They had a son together, Trey, and becoming a father cracked Will wide open. He felt something more sacred than applause. A kind of purpose that no stage could replicate. But that love came with fear too. He didn't want to fail. He didn't want to replicate the damage he'd witnessed growing up. He wanted to be the hero. And heroes don't lose their temper. Heroes don't miss the mark. So he tried to become the perfect man, the perfect partner, the perfect father. But perfection doesn't leave room for people to breathe. Will began to manage the relationship like he managed his career, always trying to make things right before they could go wrong. He'd overplan, overtalk, overdo. He would buy things when emotions ran high. He would use words when silence was needed. He tried to charm his way through conflict, to logic his way out of emotion. But Sherry didn't want a fixer. She wanted a partner. Someone to feel with her, not just think for her. Someone to hear her, not just correct the problem. The more Will tried to manage the marriage like a mission, the more distance began to grow between them. What made it worse was how invisible that control could be. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't toxic in the obvious ways. But it was heavy. It meant there wasn't space for failure or weakness or truth. And in that absence, the connection frayed. Will didn't see it immediately, because he was doing everything right. He was providing. He was present. He was invested. But he was also terrified of not being enough. And when fear is at the center of your effort, love begins to feel like labor. Meanwhile, the spotlight kept getting brighter. Hollywood was calling. Will started dreaming bigger. About movies, about legacies, about making an impact far beyond music and sitcoms. He wanted to be the biggest movie star in the world. Not out of vanity, but out of hunger. He felt like he had something to prove, not just to audiences but to himself. That he could become more than what people expected. That he could control the narrative. That he could become the architect of his own legend. But that meant more moving pieces. More people. More decisions. And more pressure to keep it all afloat. And that's the trap of alchemy. When you get a taste of transformation, when you start to believe you can turn ordinary metal into gold, you start chasing it everywhere. You try to transmute pain into performance, loss into legacy, flaws into strengths. But some things aren't meant to be converted. Some things are meant to be felt. Will hadn't learned that yet. He was still trying to conquer discomfort with logic, to master emotion with action. And deep down, he was still trying to control what couldn't be controlled, other people. How they felt. What they needed. Whether or not they stayed. The cracks were showing, but the machine kept moving. The success masked the growing disconnection. The applause drowned out the quiet ache. He didn't know how to stop. He didn't want to stop. Because stopping meant facing the truth. That he wasn't invincible. That he wasn't perfect. That love, unlike career, couldn't be earned through performance. It had to be received raw and real. In those years, he began to see that even though he was making everything look golden, something inside was slowly corroding. His marriage was straining. His sense of peace was thinning. His connection to others was starting to feel like a role, not a relationship. He had created a world so carefully manicured that nothing unpredictable could grow in it. And without unpredictability, there's no intimacy. There's only control. But control at its core is lonely. He hadn't lost anything yet. Not officially. The structure still stood. But Will was beginning to realize that true transformation wasn't about mixing the right ingredients and watching them shine. It was about surrender. About letting go of the need to manage every beat and learning to trust the mess. To trust people. To trust life. That lesson hadn't fully landed yet. He was still in the middle of the mix. Still believing he could create harmony through force of will. But the temperature was rising. The formula was unstable. And soon, the fire he'd been playing with would demand more than brilliance. It would demand truth. Because when you try to alchemize your life into perfection, eventually life fights back. Not to destroy you, but to wake you up. Chapter 9: Destruction. There's a certain point when the people around you stop nodding and start withdrawing. Not with rage or rebellion, but with silence, with hesitations, with smiles that don't reach their eyes. That's how it started for Will. Not with yelling or confrontations, but with quiet. The kind that fills a room when everyone knows something isn't working, but no one dares say it. Will had spent his whole life crafting a persona so polished, so strong, so capable, that everyone around him started adapting to it. They adjusted themselves to fit his rhythm, to meet his expectations, to avoid disappointing him. And for a while, he believed that meant things were going well. After all, things looked great. His career was soaring, The Fresh Prince was a hit, and he was carving out space in Hollywood that very few had ever touched before. But when things look good on the outside and feel hollow on the inside, that's a warning. And if you don't listen, eventually the people around you will speak in the only way they feel safe. They'll disengage. Will was a machine at this point. Always working. Always producing. Always ahead of the curve. But something had begun to shift. His desire for control, which he had always told himself was about excellence, about doing things right, was starting to push people away. He wasn't abusive. He wasn't cruel. But he was exacting, intense, relentless. Everything needed to be done a certain way, his schedule, his systems, his vision. At work, his team was exhausted. At home, his marriage was cracking. And in both places, the same quiet question was rising among the people around him. Is this who we signed up for? The problem was Will couldn't see it. Not yet. Because he had always believed that effort equaled love. That if he just tried hard enough, gave enough, fixed enough, people would feel safe. Happy. Cared for. But what he didn't realize was that his intensity was suffocating. The harder he tried to manage every variable, the more tightly he squeezed, the less space there was for others to simply be. To make mistakes. To express needs that didn't fit his plan. To just exist without performing. And when people don't feel free, they stop being honest. They start pulling away. The first wake-up call came in his marriage to Sherry. Arguments turned into silences. Affection became performance. They were no longer meeting each other in truth. Will kept trying to fix things. More gestures, more attention, more perfection. But what Sherry wanted wasn't performance. She wanted presence. Vulnerability. Space to not be okay. But Will didn't know how to offer that. He had never been taught. He only knew how to take care of others by overfunctioning. And when that didn't work, when she still felt unseen, he felt like a failure. Like he wasn't enough. At work, it was the same pattern. His staff respected him, but they were worn down. Every day was high stakes. Every detail had to be perfect. Mistakes weren't yelled at, but they were remembered. Pressure hung in the air like humidity. Will was the sun everyone revolved around, and while that power gave light, it also burned. His people weren't thriving. They were surviving. And he didn't notice until it was too late. Until the atmosphere shifted. Until people started quitting. Or disconnecting. Or worse, sticking around but quietly resenting him. One day Will overheard members of his team talking. Not loud. Not angry. But honest. They were tired. They were afraid to speak up. They felt like they were always trying to stay on his good side, never quite sure if they were safe. And that crushed him. Because Will had built his entire identity on the idea that he protected people. That he was the rock. That he made life better for those around him. And now here were people he cared about, people who had helped build his career, saying the very presence that was supposed to uplift them had become something heavy to carry. It was a sobering moment. Crack in the mirror. Will started to ask questions he hadn't dared ask before. Was he controlling people in the name of care? Was he performing love instead of practicing it? Was he building something beautiful that nobody actually wanted to live in? The answer painfully was yes. He had become so committed to his image of success, of the provider, of the hero, that he couldn't see how those very identities were isolating him. He couldn't see how people didn't need him to be perfect, they needed him to be real. The mutiny wasn't loud. It wasn't a fight. It was a withdrawal. A quiet rebellion. People were no longer willing to play supporting roles in the movie of his life. They needed their own space, their own voice, their own truth. And Will finally started to listen. It was one of the hardest things he'd ever faced, not because he was losing power but because he was losing connection. That's what hurt most. He began to see how his need for control was rooted in fear. Fear of being abandoned, fear of being helpless, fear of becoming like his father, the man who'd terrified him as a boy. So Will swung the pendulum all the way in the other direction. Control everything, manage everything, fix everything. But fear dressed in the costume of control is still fear. And fear cannot create closeness. It only builds distance. This was the beginning of Will's unraveling. Not his downfall, but his undoing. The slow dismantling of a persona that had brought him success, but was no longer serving him. He began to understand that leadership wasn't about being the smartest person in the room. It was about creating space for other people's voices. That love wasn't about planning the perfect experience. It was about being emotionally present. That family wasn't about shielding people from pain. It was about walking with them through it. He hadn't mastered it yet. Not even close. But the illusion had shattered. And once you see the truth, really see it, you can't go back. Will realized he didn't want to be admired anymore. He wanted to be known. And that meant letting go of control. Letting go of the image. Letting go of the idea that he could keep everyone happy all the time. Because control might build a legacy, but only vulnerability builds love. Chapter 10 Alchemy. Letting go didn't come to Will like a thunderclap. It didn't arrive as a clean revelation or some climactic breakdown. It came slowly like water wearing down stone. Came through exhaustion. Through silence. Through the unbearable weight of trying to be everything to everyone at all times. For so long Will had lived as the fixer, the provider, the orchestrator of joy and peace and success. His whole identity had been built on this ability to make things right. Make people laugh, make problems go away, make life line up perfectly scene after scene. He'd spent decades scripting not just his career, but his family, his friendships, even his image of himself. And somewhere along the way, the performance started to suffocate the person. It wasn't that he didn't care, he cared too much. He cared so much about not being like his father, about being dependable, loving, present, admired. He was haunted by the chaos of his childhood, by the fear in his mother's eyes, by the helplessness he'd once felt as a boy. And so, he built this structure, this system, this life where if he just worked hard enough, smiled bright enough, gave generously enough, loved intensely enough, then maybe no one would ever feel the fear he once felt. But what he didn't realize until much later was that trying to prevent all pain for others can create a different kind of pain for yourself and for them. Because control, even when born of love, is still control. And people don't thrive under control. They shrink. They conform. Or they leave. He learned that truth slowly. First through his divorce from Sherry, when he realized that being a provider isn't the same as being a partner. Then through the quiet mutiny of his team, when he heard the exhaustion in their voices as they tiptoed around his expectations. But the real shift came in his own chest, when he looked in the mirror and saw a man who was tired, not from failure, but from holding everything together. He started to understand that he hadn't been protecting people from life, he'd been protecting himself from vulnerability, from the feeling of not being in control. And to live fully, he had to face that. Letting go wasn't passive, it was work. It meant unlearning years of habits that had once served him. It meant asking for the first time, what if I don't have to carry it all? It meant acknowledging that sometimes people needed to stumble, that sometimes the lesson wasn't in being rescued, it was in falling and getting up on their own. He began to see that his obsession with harmony wasn't about peace, it was about discomfort avoidance, about keeping everything smooth so no one would have to feel pain, including himself. He began opening up in ways that felt risky, talking to his son Trey, not as a hero father, but as a flawed man who was still learning, admitting to Jada that sometimes he didn't know what he was doing, that he felt scared, that he needed help. And instead of being rejected, something miraculous happened: connection. When he stopped performing, people drew closer. When he stopped planning every moment, life surprised him. When he stopped gripping so hard, his own soul began to breathe again. With Jada, the growth deepened. She was unlike anyone he'd ever met. Strong, unshakable, unwilling to be molded. She wouldn't bend to his narratives, wouldn't participate in the curated fantasy. And at first that was disorienting. He was used to being adored. But she loved him differently. She saw through the shine and called out the cracks. And he didn't always like it, but he needed it. She forced him to confront the parts of himself that were still hiding behind the mask. She didn't want Will Smith, the icon. She wanted Will, the man. And that terrified and thrilled him. Slowly, he began surrendering his grip on the machine he'd built. He stopped trying to be the star of every room. He learned to listen, to cry, to apologize, to allow others to lead. He discovered that his value wasn't in being perfect, it was in being present. That he didn't need to earn love through performance. It was something he could simply receive. And that idea, more than anything, began to heal the deep old wounds. He had spent a lifetime trying to outrun fear. But now he realized fear isn't something you outrun. It's something you face gently, kindly, with open hands. He started to see fear as a sign, not of weakness but of opportunity. An invitation to soften, to trust, to stop managing people's experiences and start sharing your own. Letting go wasn't a single act. It was a rhythm. A practice, a surrender, sometimes daily, sometimes minute by minute. But each time he released a little more control, he reclaimed a little more of his humanity. The irony is that Will thought control was his superpower, that it made him strong. But now, in the quiet places of his life, he saw the truth. His real power was his willingness to grow, to change, to let the world see the unedited version of himself and still show up with love. That version, the man who could laugh at his flaws, own his past, and meet life without a script, that was the version worth becoming. Letting go didn't make him less. It made him real. And being real, Chapter 11 Adaptation. Strange how you can spend your whole life chasing something, and then once you have it, you're left asking why you wanted it in the first place. That's what started to happen to Will. He had chased the dream with everything he had, worked harder, ran faster, reached higher than almost anyone in the room. He had it all: the money, the legacy, the spotlight, the influence. And yet, somewhere in the silence that followed his greatest triumphs, he felt a soft ache in his chest, a sense that something important was still missing. He had been chasing success so relentlessly that he'd never slowed down long enough to ask what it was all supposed to mean. Why was he doing this? Who was it all for? Will realized that his idea of purpose had always been tied to achievement. Make your family proud. Never be poor again. Be somebody. Get famous enough that your pain can't touch you. But now that the trophies were lining his shelves, and the world called his name with admiration, the echoes felt hollow. There was no ceremony, no round of applause, no magical moment that made him feel whole. It turned out that winning the game wasn't the same as knowing why you were playing. He started looking backward, trying to trace the thread. He saw how much of his drive came from pain. The pain of watching his mother shrink in fear during his father's rages. The pain of feeling powerless. The pain of growing up believing that the only way to be safe was to be perfect. He had taken that fear and built a fortress of control around it, and for a long time it worked. He became the protector, the provider, the planner. He created a version of himself that was so competent, so polished, that nobody ever questioned if he was okay. But now, with all the control starting to slip from his hands, he was left holding the most human question of all. If I'm not fixing or achieving or performing, then who am I? The answer didn't come all at once. It came slowly in glimmers. In quiet conversations with his children. In moments with Jada when they weren't performing their roles but just being real. In walks, in stillness, in therapy, in writing. He began to realize that purpose wasn't something you earn by climbing a ladder. It was something you feel when you're in alignment with your truth. Not the polished, press-friendly version. The real truth. The raw, soft, messy core of who you are. He started asking new questions. Instead of how can I win? He asked, how can I serve? Instead of what's next? He asked, what matters? He realized that his gifts weren't just for building empires, they were for building people. Inspiring, encouraging, helping others see themselves more clearly through the reflection of his journey. It was never just about the movies or the music or the fame. It was about connection, transformation, legacy, not in the form of monuments but in moments. He looked at his family and saw that the most important work he would ever do was within those walls. The way he loved his kids, the way he respected Jada, the way he handled his regrets. That was the work of purpose. That was the work no one clapped for but mattered the most. He started showing up more open, less rehearsed. He started telling the truth about his shortcomings. Started listening more. Letting his family feel what they needed to feel without trying to fix it. Letting his kids become who they were meant to be, not who he thought they should be. He also became more selective about the roles he took, the business ventures he pursued, the people he surrounded himself with. If something didn't align with his evolving sense of self, he let it go. He wasn't chasing anymore, he was choosing. From a place of intention, not insecurity. From a place of clarity, not chaos. He began to feel that deep sense of alignment that had eluded him for so long. Not because life was perfect, but because he finally knew what he stood for. Purpose, he discovered, isn't loud. It doesn't walk into a room with a drum roll. It's quiet, steady. It's in the way you speak to someone who can do nothing for you. It's in the way you carry your pain without passing it on. It's in the small choices that no one sees but that shape the soul. Purpose is knowing that who you are when the cameras are off is someone you can be proud of. And with that realization will felt something shift. A loosening. A lightness. He was no longer performing for his father's ghost or the public's approval. He was walking his own path. Not to prove he was good enough, but to live like he already was. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't need them anymore. Because he finally understood that purpose isn't a destination. It's a direction. And as long as you're walking in alignment with your heart, you're already there. Chapter 12, Desire. Will had spent his entire life gripping the reins, convinced that if he just held tight enough, if he planned enough, performed enough, worked hard enough, he could control the outcomes. He could protect everyone. He could fix everything. He had built his empire with sheer willpower, and it had worked. He had become one of the most famous and beloved figures in entertainment, crafted an image so polished that people rarely questioned whether he was okay. And that's the danger of control, it looks so much like strength that even you start believing it's the same thing. But strength and control are not the same. We'll learn this slowly, painfully. As life began to show him that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't outsmart vulnerability. He couldn't schedule his way out of suffering. He couldn't rehearse his way into emotional intimacy. Things would still fall apart. People would still leave. Mistakes would still be made. And all his careful planning couldn't stop it. Surrender began not with a decision but with a breakdown in the system. With the realization that the system itself, his lifelong pattern of control and performance, was unsustainable. The energy it took to keep the illusion intact was draining him. And what was worse, it was distancing him from the very people he was trying to protect. His family, his team, his fans, himself. There's a moment when you're so tired of holding it all together that you stop asking, how do I keep going? And start asking, why am I still holding this? That was the beginning of surrender. started with permission. Permission to not be perfect, to not have the answer, to not carry everything. He began saying no more often, not because he didn't care, but because he finally did. About his peace, about his presence, about showing up as himself, not just the image. It wasn't easy. Letting go rarely is. He'd spent years being the fixer, the planner, the protector. So much of his identity was wrapped up in being the man who had it all together. But now he was beginning to see that real strength came from softness, not steel. From admitting you don't know. From trusting that you'll still be loved even when you're not saving the day. He began to step back. To pause. To let conversations happen without steering them. To let his kids express emotions he didn't know how to fix. To sit with Jada in discomfort instead of rushing to resolution. He started seeing how much of his control was driven by fear, not of others but of being exposed. Of being seen without the costume. But as he slowly allowed himself to show up raw and unguarded, something surprising happened. People drew closer. The fear of being seen gave way to the joy of being known. Surrender wasn't about stopping. It was about shifting. It was about trading in the frantic energy of control for the peaceful rhythm of presence. It was about releasing the fantasy that he could prevent all pain, and instead embracing the truth that pain is part of life, and part of healing. He realized he didn't need to be the author of every chapter. Sometimes he just needed to be honest on the page. That honesty showed up in conversations with his kids, when he admitted his fears instead of hiding behind fatherly wisdom. It showed up in his marriage, when he stopped performing strength and started speaking truth. It showed up in his work, when he chose projects that lit up his soul rather than stroked his ego. He began measuring success not by applause or numbers, but by how deeply he could stay connected to his own heart. We'll learn to breathe, to slow down, to sit in silence without needing to fill it. That may sound simple, but for someone who had lived his whole life moving, doing, fixing, it was a revolution. In that stillness, he met parts of himself he hadn't heard in decades. Parts that were scared, tender, curious. He began to see that surrender wasn't a collapse. It was a return. To his center. To his truth. To the child he once was, before fear made him put on armor. And in that return he found something that control could never give him. Peace. Not the peace that comes from having everything figured out, but the peace that comes from not needing to. The peace that says, I am enough even here, even now, even in the not knowing. Surrender wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. It was trust. It was the courage to believe that life had a flow of its own. And that maybe, just maybe, it would carry him somewhere beautiful if he stopped trying to steer the whole river. Chapter 13 Devotion. There comes a time when your old way of being just doesn't work anymore. Not because you've failed, but because you've outgrown it. That's what happened to Will. The armor he'd worn for decades, the charisma, the control, the relentless need to fix everything, had done its job. It had protected him. It had lifted him. But now it was suffocating him. And the man he was becoming needed something else. He needed space. He needed truth. He needed freedom from the very image he had spent so long perfecting. The revolution didn't start with a bang. It started quietly, deep inside where real change always begins. Will had spent his life being the hero of his own story. But now he was learning that the real hero's journey isn't about slaying dragons. It's about slaying your ego. It's about letting go of the story that got you here so you can write the one that leads you forward. He had surrendered. He had softened. And from that surrendered state came something he never expected. A deeper strength. Not the kind that kicks down doors, but the kind that holds the door open. The kind that listens. The kind that leads without needing to be seen. Will was discovering a new kind of power, one that came not from performance but from presence. From no longer needing to prove anything to anyone. It changed how he moved through the world. He stopped choosing projects based on what would impress people and started choosing based on what spoke to his soul. He stopped looking at every opportunity as a way to stay relevant and started asking, does this align with who I really am? It was no longer about staying at the top. It was about staying true. That alone changed everything. He re-examined his legacy, not in the public sense but in the private one. What did his kids see when they looked at him now? Did they feel safe? Did they feel seen? Could they be honest with him without fear? That was the new scoreboard. Not ticket sales, not awards. Connection. love, truth. With Jada, the work deepened. They had spent years building something complicated, part love story, part battlefield. And yet, in this new phase, they were both starting to peel back the layers. He wasn't trying to win her over anymore. He was trying to understand her, to see her as she was, not as he needed her to be. And in that process, he began to understand himself better too. It wasn't about fixing the marriage, it was about fixing the foundation, the assumptions, the silence, the fear. He listened more, apologized more, asked questions he used to avoid. And in return, he found a woman who had been waiting for him to slow down, to open up, to stop performing love and actually live it. Their bond shifted from spectacle to sanctuary. With his children, the revolution was gentler but just as deep. He stopped trying to be the ideal father and started trying to be an honest one. He let them see his flaws. Let them hear his doubts. He stepped down from the pedestal and met them at eye level. And there, in that space of equality, love flourished. They laughed more, talked more, disagreed more, and grew stronger because of it. Will also began reevaluating how he used his platform. He realized that influence without intention is just noise. He didn't want to be everywhere. He wanted to be impactful. So he got quieter, more deliberate, more thoughtful. He wasn't chasing relevance anymore. He was chasing resonance. Things that would last. Things that mattered. This personal revolution wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about remembering who he'd always been beneath the armor. The boy who loved deeply, who felt everything, who dreamed wildly, who wanted to make the world laugh. Not for attention but for connection. That boy had gotten lost along the way, buried under the weight of fame and responsibility. But now Will was finding him again. And that reunion was sacred. He forgave himself for the times he'd let people down, for the moments he'd acted out of fear instead of love, for all the ways he'd tried to be perfect instead of present. That forgiveness didn't come all at once. Came in layers, in quiet mornings, in long walks, in the simple decision to stop judging the journey and start honoring it. His revolution wasn't something the world could see, but it was everything. It was in the way he treated people, the way he answered the phone, the way he sat in silence without reaching for distraction, the way he let life be without rushing to rewrite the script. He no longer needed to conquer the world. He just needed to be fully alive in it. And that finally was enough. Chapter 14. Boom. Just when it felt like everything had clicked into place, when the growth had deepened, the peace had settled in, and the personal revolution seemed complete, life reached up and slammed him into a wall. It wasn't subtle. It was public, loud, undeniable. And it shook something loose inside him that he didn't even know was still there. That's the thing no one tells you about transformation. It's not a finish line. It doesn't come with a medal. You don't arrive. Because life always has one final exam waiting around the corner, asking not just, did you learn this? But, did it really change you? He didn't plan the moment. No one does. Came in a flash. 1 second he was in his seat. The next he was on his feet, storming forward, expression hard, jaw locked. And then it happened. A moment so shocking it echoed through the world. And all he could think afterward was, what have I just done? He knew instantly that this wasn't just about the action. It was about the trigger, the emotional current running beneath it, the buried feelings that had finally found their way out. It wasn't about the joke or the room or the cameras. It was about the boy inside him who had never truly recovered from feeling helpless, who had watched violence and never stepped in, who had vowed somewhere deep in his soul that he would never be a coward again. And in that split second, all the therapy, all the introspection, all the letting go, none of it was strong enough to stop that surge of ancient pain. When you hit a wall, there's a temptation to bounce off it, to deny it ever happened, to spin it, explain it away, bury it under statements. But Will couldn't do that. Not this time. This wall didn't just crack his image. Cracked him. And for a man who had built his identity on being unshakable, that was terrifying. Because now the world had seen something he had worked his whole life to contain. His shadow. But something strange happened in the wreckage. The performance dropped. The mask shattered. And for once he was just a man. Confused. Hurt. Exposed. No script. No charm. Just the raw edges of a human being who had tried his best, and still stumbled. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He did what the old Will never could have imagined. He sat in it. He owned it. He let the shame come. Let the grief rise. Let the disappointment burn through him. Not just disappointment in what had happened, but in the realization that healing doesn't happen on a schedule. That just because you've learned something doesn't mean you've embodied it. That even peace can be temporary when your pain hasn't fully been named. He thought about his family, his friends, his fans, the people who had walked with him for years. And he thought about what it meant to really live with integrity, not as a brand but as a human. Integrity meant telling the truth, even when it made you look bad. It meant holding your own heart in your hands and saying, "Yeah, I broke. And I'm going to learn from this." He started having real conversations, unfiltered, unscripted, with the people who mattered most. He asked hard questions, listened to hard answers. He didn't try to defend himself. He tried to understand himself. He looked in the mirror and asked, "What pain am I still carrying that let that version of me out? And more importantly, what do I need to forgive in myself so it never happens again?" He revisited the foundation, looked at the cracks, the places where ego had filled in for identity, the places where old trauma had masqueraded as strength. He realized that his need to protect, to step in, to act wasn't just about being noble. It was about avoiding helplessness. It was about rewriting history in real time. But that's not how healing works. You don't erase your pain by creating a new moment. You erase it by facing the old one. So he stopped trying to outrun it. Stopped trying to control the narrative. Stopped trying to convince anyone. He just sat with the truth of who he was in that moment. And he let it change him. Truly. Deeply. Because real growth doesn't mean you never fall. It means when you do, you know how to stand back up with grace. It means learning from the moment instead of being defined by it. It means having the courage to rebuild. Not your image, but your inner life. The wall didn't destroy him. It showed him what was still unfinished. And in that painful, humbling space, he found something more lasting than image. He found clarity. Chapter 15, Inferno. Love. The word had followed Will his entire life. It was written into his lyrics, scripted into his roles, woven into the cheers of fans and the expectations of family. But for most of his journey, Will hadn't truly understood what it meant. He thought he did. He thought love was about effort, about doing, giving, fixing. It was about protection, grand gestures, always showing up, always being strong, always knowing what to say. He thought if he worked hard enough to be lovable, he could keep people close. And for a while that formula worked. People adored him. He was celebrated, respected. But deep down something was off. Something quiet but undeniable. Because if love requires performance, then it isn't love. It's approval. He didn't realize he had confused the two until everything else fell apart. Until the applause stopped feeling warm. Until the perfection cracked and people saw the man behind the mask. And strangely, that's when love began to feel real. Not the polished kind, not the kind that fits into interviews or red carpets, but the raw, uncomfortable, breathtaking kind. The kind that doesn't ask for anything but truth. He began to understand that love isn't about what you give. It's about what you're willing to receive. And that's where Will had struggled most. Because for so long, he'd built himself into a fortress. Funny, reliable, unshakable. He was the protector, the provider, the man with the plan. But inside there was a silence, a yearning, fear. That maybe if he stopped doing, he'd stop being enough. That if he didn't prove his worth, he'd be left behind. It wasn't just a personal flaw. It was generational. It was cultural. It was a script passed down through fathers and sons, through pain and pride, through trauma and tradition. Be strong. Don't cry. Fix everything. And in trying to live out that script, Will had forgotten something essential. Love doesn't need you to be perfect. It needs you to be present. So he began to show up differently. Not with answers but with honesty. Not with a mask but with his whole face. With Jada, that meant letting go of the need to be her protector and becoming her partner. Letting her feel pain without rushing to rescue. Letting her speak without trying to edit. Letting her grow into her own self. Even when it didn't align with his story of what love should look like. It meant loving her not as an extension of himself, but as her own world. A world he could choose to explore, not control. It wasn't always easy. Love never is. especially not after years of performing it. But in those quiet moments when he listened instead of leading, when he stayed instead of solving, something softened, something healed. And that's when he realized, love isn't something you give because you're strong. It's something you share when you're willing to be seen. With his children, love transformed from protection to presence. He stopped trying to mold them and started learning from them, stopped parenting from fear and started relating from faith. He didn't need to create a perfect legacy for them. He needed to be a living example of what it means to be human, flawed, growing, loving anyway. And the more he let go, the closer they became. Not because they needed his guidance, but because they trusted his heart. The real revolution, though, happened within. Because the hardest love to accept is the one you give yourself. Will had always found it easier to love others, to be their cheerleader, their anchor. But when it came to himself, he had been stingy, harsh, demanding. He had tied his worth to his wins, his goodness to his image, his value to his usefulness. But now, standing in the ruins of performance, he started whispering a different message. You are worthy even when you're not doing anything at all. He forgave himself for the moments of shame, the outbursts, the old coping mechanisms, the miscues in relationships. He stopped expecting himself to have all the answers. He allowed the discomfort of being human to be part of his story. And slowly, gently, he began loving the boy inside who just wanted to be enough. The one who thought being funny would keep the pain away. The one who thought being successful would mean being loved forever. The one who never stopped trying. He began to see love not as a reward but as a right. Not as something you earn but something you remember. It became the lens through which he saw everything. The silence between conversations, the way his daughter's eyes sparkled when she sang, the quiet support in Jada's presence, the softness of his own breath when he finally gave himself permission to rest. Love was no longer a performance. It was no longer a strategy. It was a state of being. And in that state, he no longer needed to be the fresh prince. He didn't need to be the hero, the fixer, the charming face of a perfect life. He just needed to be Will. Messy, growing, learning, loving. And that finally was more than enough. Chapter 16, Purpose. Letting go doesn't happen all at once. It's not a decision stamped with finality or a ceremony that declares your burdens vanished. It's subtle, repetitive, quiet. Will didn't realize he was letting go until he noticed how light he had started to feel. Not because the weight was gone, but because he had stopped gripping it so tightly. For most of his life, control had been his compass. He had learned early that if you could anticipate pain, you might be able to avoid it. If you could shape your surroundings, maybe you could keep love close. So he became a master of managing everything. People's emotions, the energy in the room, the public image, the private storms. But underneath it all, he was exhausted. Not from doing too much, but from holding on too hard. Letting go felt terrifying at first. The idea that things could move without him directing them, that love could survive without his protection, that life could unfold without his performance, that was foreign. His mind raced with old fears. What if everything fell apart? What if people left? What if success faded? But eventually, through the storms and the silence, he realized something simple but life-changing. Things falling apart sometimes make space for the right things to come together. He didn't have to control the entire picture. He just had to be true in his part of it. And so he began to surrender. Not in a passive, defeated way, but in an awake, courageous one. He began to trust the natural order of life. Trust that people had their own paths. That pain had its purpose. That growth couldn't always be planned. He let his children find their own rhythm. Let Jada be exactly who she was, without needing her to match his expectations. Let the world see him flawed and real. He stopped explaining himself to protect his image. He stopped performing in places where truth was enough. He stopped needing closure for everything. Some things didn't make sense. Some people didn't apologize. Some questions never got answered, and he made peace with that. Letting go, he found, was less about resolving the past and more about releasing the need to rewrite it. What happened had happened, but who he chose to become in the aftermath, that was still his. Letting go also meant allowing joy to come without suspicion. For so long he'd been waiting for the next hit, the next fall, the next thing to go wrong. But now he started letting himself feel the good moments fully, without the shadow of what might follow. A morning laugh with his kids, A quiet evening with Jada. A walk with no purpose other than presence. He stopped chasing peace and started noticing it. Already there. He let go of the need to be the best. Let go of the myth that if you worked hard enough, you could outrun your pain. Let go of the belief that love had to be earned, or that it could be lost by being too human. He let go of timelines, of comparisons, of punishment. He let himself be. He also let go of the old version of himself, the one who needed to be everything to everyone, the one who held his breath in fear of messing up, the one who thought his value lived in applause. That will had served his purpose. He had brought him this far. But now it was time to make room for someone softer, freer, more whole. And so he walked into this next chapter of life not with answers, but with openness. He didn't need to fix everything. He didn't need to know what was next. He had what he needed. Clarity, love, presence, truth. The ability to sit still in discomfort. To laugh again. To forgive again. To start again. Letting go didn't mean letting go of ambition or creativity or connection. It meant letting go of the desperation behind those things. The fear. The proving. The pressure. And in that release he found something better than perfection. He found peace. Not the peace that comes from everything being okay, but the peace that comes from being okay no matter what. Chapter 17 Perfection. Sometimes the most exhausting thing isn't doing too much. It's being someone you're not. Waking up every day as the version of yourself that you think everyone else wants or worse needs. Will had lived like that for most of his life. He wasn't just successful, he was curated, sharpened, polished. Every word calculated, every appearance an extension of the myth. He didn't just play roles on screen, he carried them off screen too. The charmer, the motivator, the guy with the answers. But deep inside, a different voice had been whispering for years, soft, almost drowned out. Let me be me. And finally he was ready to listen. He'd built his life around energy, light, making people feel good. It was more than a gift, it was a survival skill. In every room he knew how to read the air, feel the tension, adjust his presence. He could make anyone laugh, smooth over conflict, keep the vibe just right. But the cost of all that emotional labor was steep, because after years of making sure everyone else felt safe, he wasn't sure anymore what his safety felt like. He had become a character in his own story, and now, stripped of the distractions, he had to ask himself, who am I when I stop performing? It's not a question many people get the chance to ask out loud, especially not when the world has already made up its mind about who you are. But Will had come too far to turn away now. He started watching himself differently, less as a star, more as a human. He noticed the micro moments, when he felt himself fake a smile, when he gave the right answer instead of the true one, when his shoulders tightened at the idea of being misunderstood. These weren't personality quirks, they were signals. Signs that somewhere deep down, he was still afraid that being just Will might not be enough. But this time, he didn't try to fix it with charisma or control. He sat in it. He remembered being a kid in Philly before the spotlight, before the expectations. Just a goofy, bright-eyed boy with a wild imagination and a desperate need to be seen. Not for being good, or smart, or entertaining, but simply for being. That boy was still in him, still waiting. And Will started reconnecting with that part of himself not through performance, but through stillness, through listening, through silence. He found himself no longer interested in the games of status, the press, the optics, the pressure. He wasn't angry at them, he just didn't need them anymore. Not to feel whole, not to feel alive. He began to re-meet his family, not as a protector or provider, but as a person. He listened more, pushed less, told the truth more, apologized without qualification. And in those simple moments, something shifted. People didn't love him less, they loved him more. Because he wasn't hiding. He wasn't managing. He was present. That presence began spilling into everything. His conversations, his parenting, his love, his art. He started choosing from his soul, not his brand. He stopped worrying about whether people would understand his evolution. It wasn't theirs to understand. It was his to live. And he found that when he gave himself permission to be fully him, others around him softened too. His openness became a mirror. It gave others space to be real, vulnerable, unscripted. It was messy, sure, but it was real. And that, finally, felt like freedom. Because freedom isn't having everything under control. Freedom is not needing control to feel safe. We'll learn that the truest love doesn't come from admiration. It comes from recognition. When someone sees you not as a projection, but as a person. Not as an icon, but as a soul. He was finally beginning to let people see that person. And more importantly, he was beginning to see him too. Let me be me. That wasn't a request to the world anymore. It was a promise to himself. Chapter 18, Mutiny. There's a silence that doesn't soothe. A kind of quiet that isn't peaceful. It's loaded. Uncomfortable. Restless. It's the silence that comes after something breaks. After something sacred is shattered. Not by accident, but by your own hand. That's where Will found himself. In a moment that didn't just shake the world outside, but shook the one inside of him. The part he'd spent decades perfecting, protecting, performing. And now no stage, no smile, no story could soften the edges of this truth. He had crossed a line. He had spent a lifetime mastering the art of being in control. The way he talked. The way he walked into rooms. The way he managed energy. He could disarm tension with a joke, shift a conversation with charm, lift an entire crowd with a single smile. He was so used to managing his image that he didn't always recognize when he wasn't managing himself. He'd told himself for years that he was the protector, the provider, the peacemaker. But beneath that was another story, one written in silence, stitched together by fear, hurt, and buried rage. And then it all came to the surface. This wasn't a moment of villainy. It was a moment of overflow. A moment when years of swallowing emotion erupted into action. Will had built his life on being the one who doesn't break. But no one escapes unbroken. And in this moment, something inside him cracked open in full view of the world. The shame was immediate. And it wasn't about what others would think. It was deeper. It was about who he saw in the mirror. The man who had spent his whole life trying to make people feel good had caused harm. And the weight of that couldn't be dodged. There was no witty comeback. No graceful pivot. Just consequences. And the long, slow breath of accountability. But Will didn't run. He didn't spin. He didn't distract. He listened. First, to those he had hurt. Then to himself. To the voice he'd silenced for too long. The one that had whispered warnings when tension built. The one that had asked for help. For rest. For truth. And he began to understand. The explosion didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of bottling, masking, overcompensating. From a system he inherited about what it meant to be a man, strong, silent, unshakable. But unshakable often just means unreachable. He started tracing the roots. Back to childhood. Back to moments where expressing pain wasn't safe. Where tears were swallowed, and emotions were translated into actions. Back to the times he took on more than was his to carry. Because fixing was easier than feeling. The realization hit hard. He hadn't been fully present in his own emotional life. He had been managing it like a business, efficient, impressive, and unsustainable. He didn't ask the world for forgiveness. Not because he didn't want it, but because he knew that real repair starts inside. With owning. With sitting in the discomfort. With changing not for show but for real. So he turned inward. He created space. Space for reflection. For apology. For learning how to feel without flinching. How to be honest without armor. He started speaking less and listening more. Especially to those who weren't afraid to challenge him. He let his family see him, not as the fixer, but as the one needing fixing. He stopped defending. Stopped justifying. Started understanding. And the more he understood, the less he clung to the version of himself he had always shown the world. He didn't need to be bulletproof. He needed to be whole. And wholeness doesn't come from performance. It comes from repair. From choosing, again and again, to love differently. To speak more softly. To take responsibility, not just for outcomes, but for impact. The truth is, none of us are immune to crossing lines. The difference is what we do afterward. Do we hide? Deflect? Blame? Or do we step into the fire and become someone new? Will chose the fire. He began to rebuild. Not his image but his integrity. Not his career, but his character. He surrounded himself with truth-tellers. He held space for pain he had caused. And he kept showing up. Not because he had something to prove, but because he had someone to become. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't headline-worthy. It was quiet work. The kind that happens in private, behind closed doors, in vulnerable conversations and sleepless nights. And that's where real growth happens, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows where you decide to become someone better. Will knew he couldn't change the past, but he could change himself. He could become a man whose strength was not in his silence, but in his softness. A man who didn't need control to feel worthy. A man who didn't need to win to feel whole. And maybe that's what healing really is. The choice to live differently when you finally know better. To not just regret, but to repair. To not just confess, but to change. He was doing that now. One breath at a time. Chapter 19 Retreat. Sometimes peace isn't a loud declaration. It's not something you earn or achieve. Sometimes it's just space. Space to breathe. Space to stop. Space to not be on. After the turbulence, after the unraveling, after the long silence that followed his breaking point, Will found himself standing in that kind of space. Not because he had figured it all out, but because for once he wasn't chasing anything. Not a comeback. Not a narrative. Not even closure. He just paused. And in that pause, he felt something unfamiliar. Not anxiety. Not pressure. But clarity. The kind that doesn't shout, it whispers. It sits in the corners of your day and invites you to slow down. It shows up when you're not proving anything to anyone. For the first time in a long time, Will wasn't trying to be something. He wasn't angling for a next big thing. He wasn't curating. He was just living. Moment by moment. Breath by breath. He started to realize that for so many years, his life had been about motion. Projects. Goals. Building. Fixing. Reinventing. But now there was stillness. And that stillness didn't feel like idleness, it felt like truth. It felt like walking into a room and not needing to be the brightest presence in it. Like waking up and not needing to have 10 things on your schedule to feel like you mattered. Like letting go of conversations that drained you. Letting your phone ring without feeling guilty for not answering. Saying no because no is a complete sentence. This shift wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. But it changed everything. Will started noticing the small joys again. The way sunlight fell through the window in the afternoon. The way laughter sounded when nobody was trying to impress anyone. The way he felt when he was just sitting still. No camera, no mic, no audience, just being. He had spent so long trying to build a legacy, he hadn't realized he'd been neglecting a life. The version of success he once chased, the numbers, the headlines, the chart toppers, had brought him everything and yet left something undone. He didn't resent it. He just didn't need it anymore. Not to feel full. Not to feel seen. The applause had once been oxygen. Now presence was enough. He started removing the unnecessary. Not in some minimalist performance, but in a heartfelt reclaiming of his own energy. He let go of old ideas, old dynamics, old obligations that had expired quietly but were still hanging on out of habit. He stopped rushing. Started noticing. Started saying yes to things that brought peace, and no to things that brought chaos even if they looked good from the outside. In that stillness, Will began to understand that the most meaningful transformation doesn't come from adding more. It comes from subtracting, stripping away everything that's not essential, until only the true, unshakable parts of you remain. He found himself reevaluating creativity. He no longer needed to make things to prove something. He wanted to make things that came from his gut. His spirit. He stopped trying to be impressive and started being expressive. Not because he had to, because it felt real. Right. Honest. That honesty bled into every part of his life. His conversations became simpler. His relationships deeper. He started listening more, not because he had answers but because he didn't. He stopped being the one who needed to guide, lead, teach. He let himself learn again. He let himself be soft. And in that softness he found joy. Not fireworks joy. Quiet joy. The kind that hums in your chest during a walk. The kind that rises when your child says something ordinary, but it hits you in the heart. The kind that doesn't require explanation or performance. Just presence. He thought a lot about legacy. What it meant. What it didn't. For years he believed legacy was about what you leave behind. The awards, the films, the legend. But now he was realizing it was also about how you live while you're here. How people feel around you. Whether your presence creates peace or pressure. Whether you let others breathe when they're around you, or make them feel like they need to be on. He thought about his kids, about how much he'd once tried to direct their journeys, not out of ego but out of love. But even love, when filtered through fear and control, can be suffocating. Now he wanted to give them what he had finally found: space. To fall, to rise, to choose. He didn't need to be the architect of their story. He just needed to show up in it, fully, honestly, without a script. He stopped striving, stopped optimizing, stopped asking, "What's next?" and started asking, "What's now?" And in the now, he found something he hadn't felt in years. Not thrill, not power, not performance. He found peace. Not because everything was perfect. Not because he had arrived. But because he was finally walking with himself, not ahead, not behind, not in denial. Just in rhythm. That, he realized, was the point all along. Chapter 20: Surrender. At some point in your life, the greatest form of power stops being control and becomes surrender. Will had spent decades crafting his world with intention, precision, and relentless drive. He knew how to manifest, how to discipline, how to dominate every room he entered. If there was a path, he could walk it. If there wasn't, he could build one. His entire identity had been shaped by the strength of his will. But now, after everything, he stood in a kind of stillness that couldn't be conquered, only entered. This was different. This was surrender. He wasn't surrendering because he lost. He was surrendering because he had finally realized what winning actually meant. The force that had propelled him to the top of every mountain was the same one that had silently drained him for years. The unrelenting belief that he had to control everything. Control the brand. Control the narrative. Control the outcomes. But now, after all the peaks and all the valleys, he was beginning to see that the freedom he had longed for, the deep soul-level exhale, was never going to come from control. It was going to come from letting go. And so, he did something completely unfamiliar. He stopped pushing. He stopped planning every detail of his days. He stopped needing answers for every question. He stopped measuring the value of a moment by its productivity. Instead, he began to allow, to breathe, to feel, to just be. He traveled to India. Not to find something new, but to remember something ancient. Something that had always lived within him, but had been buried beneath years of performance and noise. In India, everything was alive and chaotic and sacred and wild. There was no hiding there. The streets moved like rivers, conversations flowed like poetry, and the spiritual energy was so present it seemed to hum beneath your feet. It was in that beautiful chaos that he found a rare kind of peace. He spent days in silence, sat in the presence of monks, meditated beneath the trees, removed the noise, and the more external chaos he allowed, the more internal stillness he found. For a man who had spent his whole life mastering how to make things happen, this was a revolution. The realization that some of the most important things in life don't come from doing, they come from receiving. He started to feel that the rigidness of his former self, the structure, the rules, the emotional lockdown wasn't strength. It was a shield, a shell. And that shell, once protective, had become restrictive. So he let it crack. Let the light in. Let himself be vulnerable, not as an act of bravery, but as a way of finally coming home to who he truly was. This didn't make him weaker. It made him real. And realness, unfiltered, present, unperformed realness, was the one thing he hadn't fully allowed himself to experience until now. He began to observe his life without judgment. The patterns, the people, the roles he had played, and the masks he had worn. He didn't try to fix them. He simply noticed. And in that noticing, things began to soften. The urge to control his kids' futures? It faded. The need to manage every conversation? Gone. The desire to prove his worth? Dissolved. He began to see that surrender is not a singular act. It's a daily rhythm, a moment-by-moment choice. To soften rather than tense. To trust rather than grasp. To breathe rather than force. He had spent his life becoming the man who could do anything. But now, he was becoming the man who didn't need to do everything in order to feel worthy. In the past, his strength came from performance. Now it came from presence. He showed up differently. In conversations, he listened without interrupting. In parenting, he allowed his children their own journey, rather than directing it. In creativity, he made space for joy and curiosity instead of needing to make a hit. And in relationships, he no longer tried to win love. He simply gave it. That was the freedom he'd been searching for all along. Not the freedom to escape life. The freedom to exist fully inside of it. Without masks. Without noise. Without needing the world's permission to rest or feel or simply be. And the most beautiful part? The more he let go, the more love flowed in. Not admiration. Love. Quiet, unwavering, real love. The kind that sticks around when you're not shining. The kind that listens when you're not speaking. The kind that grows in the silence. This chapter of his life wasn't marked by a new film or a shiny award. It was marked by a slow and radical transformation. One where Will stopped being the man everyone expected and became the man he was born to be. Not perfect, but present. Not untouchable, but deeply alive. And that was enough. Chapter 21 Love. Endings rarely look the way we think they will. They don't always come with fireworks or applause. Sometimes they come with silence, with stillness, with a single breath that says, "I'm done running." That's where Will found himself. Not at the end of his career, but at the edge of something even more sacred, himself. He had spent a lifetime becoming a star, becoming a provider, becoming a symbol. Every step he took was a step forward in the eyes of the world. But now, in this final chapter, he was no longer walking forward. He was turning inward. He began to look back, not to relive the past but to release it. Not with regret, with reverence. Every mistake, every heartbreak, every triumph had brought him here, to this exact place. Not to a finish line but to a mirror, a moment, a reckoning. And what he saw in that mirror wasn't a flawless man. It was a man who had been willing to try, willing to fail, willing to break, willing to rise again. The whole journey, the comedy, the discipline, the love, the shame, it had all been one long becoming. Not into a better version of himself, but into a truer one. He thought about the boy he used to be, the one who cracked jokes to survive the chaos in his home, the one who believed that if he could just be good enough, impressive enough, perfect enough, everything would be okay. That boy had done the best he could. He deserved more than admiration. He deserved compassion. And now Will was finally able to give that boy what no one else ever could: peace. He didn't need to dominate anymore. Didn't need to win every room. Didn't need to be a superhero. What he needed was something much simpler, much softer. He needed to be held by himself, by love, by the stillness that comes when you stop needing to be anything other than what you are. So he slowed down. He spoke less, listened more, loved without trying to protect himself. Let his children be who they were, not extensions of who he was. Let his partner see him, not as a provider or a prince, but as a man who was still figuring it all out. He stopped reaching for legacy and started reaching for presence. Not what will people remember about me, but how do they feel when they're with me now? He let go of the idea that peace was something you arrived at, and started understanding that peace is something you choose. Every morning, every moment, in how you speak, in how you breathe, in how you forgive, especially how you forgive yourself. That forgiveness wasn't a one-time act. It was a rhythm, a relationship, a gentle hand on the shoulder saying, "You did your best, and you are still becoming." Because that's the thing. We never stop becoming. Not if we're brave. Not if we're honest. Not if we keep choosing to show up even when it's hard. So he did. He kept showing up. Not as the fresh prince. Not as the action hero. Not as the blockbuster name. Just as Will. A man. A soul. A witness to his own unfolding. He wasn't chasing happiness anymore. He was happiness. He was presence. He was peace. And in the stillness of this final chapter, he didn't find an ending. He found a home.